All right, so here's the title of my talk, Ecological Crisis, Are Emotions Key to Mitigation? You may have heard this talk by Greta Thunberg, where she says, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And whether or not you may have heard other people who really want to mitigate the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, appeal to the emotions, call for heightened emotions among their audience. So besides Greta Thunberg's talk, there have been calls for heightened anger, frustration, or indignation, for compassion, for hope, for rage, or for love, among others. And it's not just activists or politicians who care about the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss. Behavior and social scientists too call for heightened emotions, as they think that emotion may play an important or even a key role for the mitigation of the ecological crisis. In this talk, I'll address this idea that emotions may be key to mitigation, this hypothesis, by first introducing two ideas about emotion and attempting interpretation of these two ideas that may lead one to think that emotions may indeed be key to mitigation. Then I'll present to you a brief summary of appraisal theories of emotion, which are widespread influential theories in the psychology of emotion. And I'll draw negative conclusions from appraisal theories about the role that emotion can play for mitigation. And if I have time, I'll briefly touch on positive conclusions about that role. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. So the two ideas I want to talk about are rather popular ideas in the philosophy of emotion. The first one is that when we undergo emotions, we perceive values. So for instance, when we undergo fear, we perceive the danger of the situation. When we undergo anger, we perceive the offense, how we've been offended, or how our friends or people we care about have been offended. That in sadness, we perceive an irrevocable loss we've suffered, and so on and so forth. It's an idea that I think under some interpretation is true, is an important insight about emotions. The second one too, I think is an important insight about emotion that in a certain sense is true. And it is the idea that emotions motivate us to act. So in fear, we would be extra motivated to avoid a threat. In anger, we'd be extra motivated to be hostile towards those that have caused the offense. In sadness, we'd be motivated to give in, perhaps, to retreat, to stop what we are doing, and so on for each emotion kind. An attempting interpretation of these two ideas is that what I call the naive causal interpretation, and it says that emotions cause new perceptions of values and new motivations to act. And I'm gonna argue that we should resist this tempting interpretation given what we know about emotions from appraisal theories. So my main claim would be that insights from affective sciences, and in particular from appraisal theories, render the naive causal interpretation doubtful. So let's see why through a brief presentation of appraisal theories of emotion. The core hypothesis of these different appraisal theories is that emotions are elicited by evaluations or appraisals of situations given one's concerns and one's coping options. And the main rationale for this hypothesis is that there are no one-to-one relations between types of emotional stimuli and types of emotional responses. So, given one type of stimuli, for instance, the introduction of a new carbon tax, there will probably be many types of emotional responses. Some people may be angry that the tax is introduced, some are relieved, some happy, some indifferent, some indignant, some fearful, and so on. On the other hand, many types of stimuli, many different types of stimuli may cause the same type of emotional response. So for instance, sadness may be elicited by a partner breaking up with us. It may be elicited by our favorite football teams losing. It may be elicited by the loss of a toy we like very much, and so on. Many different types of stimuli cause the same type of emotional response. And so appraisal theory says to explain this, we should acknowledge that it is not types of situations that cause emotions, but rather types of evaluations, types of interpretations of how the situation is relevant to one's concerns and how one is able to cope with it or not. So this is a scheme presenting appraisal theories which see emotions, represented by the four rectangles here, as being caused by stimuli, concerns, and action repertoire or coping options that are praised in a certain way. So for instance, in fear, those are appraised as a threat, as constituting a threat, with which we have low coping potential, that is hard to deal with, and so that demands an urgent, potent response. This appraisal causes one to be motivated and ready to act in certain ways. So in fear, typically we are motivated to avoid a threat. This in turn causes physiological and motor responses that prepare for this type of action. So in fear, our heart pumps faster, for instance, to prepare for the avoidance of the threat. And all of those together cause the emotional feelings. So this process happens extremely fast before the emotional feelings is changed in any way. So this was a very brief summary of appraisal theories, but hopefully it should be sufficient to explain what I'm going to say next. And why it should lead us to draw some negative conclusions about the role that emotion can play for ecological mitigation. So let's go back to the two ideas about emotion and the tempting interpretation that I talked about in the introduction. So the first idea you may remember was that when we undergo emotions, we perceive values. We perceive a threat, for instance, or danger when we undergo fear. Appraisal theories see that idea as follows. We start with certain concerns. For instance, we are concerned about our safety or the safety of those we care about. We then appraise the situation as relevant to our concern. And this causes changes in other emotional components, so action tendencies, physiological and motor changes, and emotional feelings. And these components include mental changes, so changes in feelings, but also changes in attention, memory retrieval, or imagination. When you are afraid, you will pay attention to what you're afraid about mostly. You may try to remember how you dealt with such threats in the past, or imagine how you can deal with it. And emotional episodes, and steps 2 and 3 may be considered as perceptions of value in some sense. And in that sense, the moral of the story is that emotional episodes supervene on perceptions of values insofar as they involve steps 2 and step 3, according to appraisal theories. In either case, whether in both, if we consider either steps 2 or steps 3 or both as perceptions of values, the naive causal interpretations of the first idea is false because emotions don't cause new perceptions of value, they supervene on those perceptions. Though there may be feedback effect, this is important to note, in particular because of the shift in our attention, memory retrieval, and imagination, we may discover or think we discover new information that may be relevant to our concerns, and so lead us to new appraisals um, of the situation, and thereby to motivate us in certain way and to make us perceive the situation differently. But this feedback effect, importantly, are only possible once the emotion is triggered in the first place, so that the naive causal interpretation is not true. It's not true that emotions cause us to perceive new perceptions of values in the first place. The second idea you may remember was that emotions motivate us to act. According to appraisal theories, this is how we should think of that. So first, there are appraisals of one's coping potential given one's action repertoire. So for instance, in fear, we appraise that we have a low coping potential given the threat. Otherwise, we wouldn't be afraid. If we appraised, if we evaluated the situation in such a way that we could, we think, easily deal with it with no effort, that wouldn't lead to fear. These appraisals lead to types of action readiness and association motivation to act, and the emotional feelings that ensue include the feeling of being motivated to act caused by the initial appraisals. The moral of the story, once again, is that emotional motivation is caused by the appraisal of how we can best cope with the situation. It's not the emotional episode that triggers this evaluation. So contra the naive causal interpretation, emotions don't cause the motivation to act, but rather supervene on such a motivation. Though once again, there may be feedback effects, as I explained in the preceding slide. Briefly, because I don't think I have much time left, the fourth part of the paper, and by the way, if you want to have a more complete story about what I'm saying here, I'm happy to send you the paper version of this talk. In this fourth part, I try to draw some more positive conclusions from appraisal theories. It's a short part though. And basically I say that emotions can be seen as, according to appraisal theories, as amplifiers of evaluations and motivations. Although they don't cause new evaluations and motivation, feedback effects of emotional episodes may amplify one's evaluation and motivation. The second role they can play for mitigation is as powerful signals of evaluations and motivations. Emotions may be thought of as honest or quasi-honest signals of one's evaluation and motivation, insofar as it would be costly to fake emotions. And for that reason, they are a pretty reliable signal. Furthermore, they are quite easily detectable in general because we tend to express our emotions in ways that are quite visible. So emotions may play two roles as signals. First, as broadcasting device, in the sense that we may, through powerful signals, broadcast our evaluations and motivations. And I think that's what Greta Thunberg, for instance, does in her speeches when we can see how she feels. But emotions can also can play important roles as flags for acceptability, in the sense that acceptability for certain norms and values, in the sense that if you see how a certain population, for instance, reacts to the introduction of a carbon tax, and you see that they react with anger, for instance, this tells you a lot about their evaluations and motivations. In conclusion, emotions are not magical spells that could make people realize the importance of the ecological crisis and act accordingly. Because emotions don't cause ex nihilo new perceptions of values and motivations to act, as they presuppose concerns and motivational dispositions that were already present. They may nevertheless play roles for mitigation as amplifiers and as powerful signals of evaluations and motivation. Thank you for your attention.